Welcome to the Movement Upgraded podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jen Hosler, licensed physical therapist and certified strength and mobility coach. Here you can expect to hear about all things movement. The Movement Upgraded podcast is a blend of the science of strength training, rehab, and mobility, mixed with the personal and professional experience to provide you with the steps you need to keep your body pain-free and moving well, so you can do what you love forever. Welcome back to the podcast. This is episode number 11, and in this episode specifically, we are going to cover exercise considerations for those who tend to fall on the hypermobile end of the spectrum. So this is going to be some things to keep in mind if you have ever been diagnosed with hypermobility, if you work with other people who tend to fall on that more hypermobile spectrum. We're going to talk about what is normal versus considered hypermobile, and then we're going to go into some things to keep in mind for working with or for being a person who is experiencing hypermobility. So with that being said, let's kind of jump right into what hypermobility is. And there isn't like a perfect definition of it. It's really just defined as excessive flexibility or joints that can move beyond the norm. I don't love this definition, and this is kind of going back to some things I've said in the podcast before. We don't have a great way of determining what is quote unquote normal. I do think the ranges of motion norms, quote unquote, again, these air quotes that you can't see, I do think that they are based off of a general population, which doesn't necessarily, to me, dictate the most normal type of joint that I would want to base range of motion off of. But with that being said, that's what we have access to, or what we have available right now. So that's kind of the way it's defined. The way that I explain these things to the people that I work with is that mobility is a spectrum, and flexibility is kind of on a spectrum, and your general mobility exists on a spectrum. Of course, you can be super flexible in some areas and not in others. And so I don't love to package everybody all up in one. You're either hypermobile or you are immobile, and that to me is a blanket statement, and that's what an assessment is really for. So we never want to assume that just because you're hypermobile that you don't need to stretch anything, and just because maybe you're super mobile everywhere that you do need to stretch every single thing. An assessment will give you an idea on what you need to be doing. So with that being said, there is a spectrum on where people tend to kind of fall in overall. So if we zoom out a little bit and think about their general mobility across all of their joints, there is going to be some people who are generally just stiffer in every range of motion. And this is definitely true. This is some of my own experience when I assess people. People tend to fall on the spectrum. So one end, we have everybody who is super stiff, very inflexible. They have been a lot of their lives. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we'll have people who have actual hypermobility disorders. So there is a whole slew of disorders, one of those being Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and that is also known as EDS, and that is an actual connective tissue disorder that's well known and has a lot of complicated factors. I'm going to talk a little bit about it today. I am by no means an expert in it, but I have worked with a handful of patients who suffer from that, and they usually have a whole slew of other things going on, and it's a lot of medical management on top of doing our traditional strengthening. And so I'm going to discuss some of the things that I pay attention to when I work with these patients and clients, but of course, again, this is not my expertise. It's just things that I have gathered from doing my own learning and working with people. So we have that on the hypermobile spectrum. Most of my population that I work with is women, and most women in general tend to be a little bit more hypermobile or a little bit more bendy. And that has implications that I'm going to talk about today, but they tend to be a little bit more flexible. And I will find common patterns like that, and I always pay attention to it. But again, like I said earlier, we don't want to make assumptions about everybody's entire body before we just assess them, because I have worked with people who are hyper flexible or very mobile, and I will still give them stretches and oh my gosh, gasp, what? You're still giving them stretches? Haven't we moved past the stretching? I'm just gonna tell you right now, no, and stretching is a very specific tool for a very specific purpose, and when done appropriately, it can be super helpful, but we tend to not understand that in the movement and fitness industry. Like, we just get very weird about the application of scientific principles when it comes to stretching. So with that being said, let's talk about what it typically will look like if you are hypermobile. So there is a scale or a screen that we can use called the Baton score, and there are 9 criteria that you can check off. And I don't necessarily check this out, but when I work with people, I'll get an idea because you'll be able to notice that. So these are people who typically can really hyperextend their knees, hyperextend their elbows. They can bend their pinky into extension past 90 degrees or 290 degrees or more. They can touch their thumb to their forearm in hyperflexion. I think that's the movement, yes. And I think they'll be able to palm the ground if they are standing and they reach down with their knees locked out or straight. So, and I think that was all of them, or that was some of them. But that is a scale that we check, and you can check. I don't necessarily do that, but when I'm working with people, it'll just be like, as I'm going through, there'll be tons of range of motion. I'm not getting a lot of resistance as I'm assessing them, and I can just move their bodies everywhere. The thing that I will also notice on individuals who are hypermobile is as I'm trying to assess their hip, their whole body's coming along for the ride. And I will start to move them, and I will have to make sure I'm very specific about pinning one area down to make sure that when I'm doing my assessment, nothing else is joining, and it's really just isolating the movement at that joint. The other thing I will notice is they are really great compensators. So I will ask them to move something. Maybe we're doing a shoulder car or something along those lines, and they'll get lots of movement, and it may be subtle, but they'll be using everything else to get that movement. My favorite explanation for that to see in an assessment, or my favorite way to see that, or the way this presents itself very often, is in our hip. And a lot of people who are hypermobile have lots of range of motion in their spines. They can move it all over. Their pelvis moves a ton. And so because they can, it might be a little bit quicker or easier for them to move their pelvis or their spine than actually stabilize that area and just move their hip in a hip car. And this is something I see in so many people, is the inability to know when their hip is moving versus their spine. So usually people who are hypermobile will lack some body control, quite a bit of body control, and they will lack quite a bit of awareness and like the ability to tell where their body is in space. And these people will have large deficits in their active and passive ranges of motion. So I will go through and assess them. I'll move their body to their passive range of motion because I'm doing the movement. That's what passive range of motion is. And then I'll ask them to hold it, or I'll ask them to demo the movement. And when they try to hold, they try to either bring every other body part along for the ride. So they try to compensate, or they are unable to do anything. They don't even know their body exists in that movement or in that position, and it'll fall. Like they'll just be like, I can't lift it, or I can't move it, or it just falls back to the start position or the neutral position. And that's very common. So large passive and active deficits just means now we have a big opportunity for momentum or gravity to pull us into positions that we don't necessarily have control of. So if we do that, then we're going to rely on some of our more passive structures to dissipate the forces. And those are supposed to be backup structures. Those are supposed to be structures that we rely on at the last minute. And if we don't have our own muscle like strength or control, then we have to rely on those. And if we're not working on progressively overloading those, that's where an injury happens. So a large active to passive deficit is definitely going to be an opportunity or a recipe for injury, especially if we're now doing things very quickly with high loads and it's very forcefully. But at best, it's really just untapped potential. If you have all these ranges of motion and these options for movement and you can't access them, you can't utilize them. So if you're on a table and I'm asking you to move your leg and you can barely move it, but when I move it, it's going like all the way up to your face, then there's a huge potential there for you to have a lot of strength to be able to move your leg. It's just going to take a lot of work, and it's like boring work because now you have to get into positions where you're not strong enough to lift your leg, but you're going to contract the crap out of your muscles and nothing's going to happen for a very long time. That is in summary what happens with mobility training. So these are kinds of the things that people with hypermobility or more flexibility are going to experience. These are the people who are going to be like, often will feel that everything feels really tight. This is very common. So they'll be like, everything feels really tight. I feel like I'm stretching all the time. time and nothing's getting better. And that is the perfect example of why everybody hates on stretching nowadays, is because we perpetuated stretching as this response to, if it hurts, stretch it. But there is a problem there. So we should not be stretching things that hurt or that feel tight. Stretching is not a relief tool. It is a tool to train your flexibility. I'm going to say that again. Stretching is not a relief tool. It is a tool to train your flexibility. It is a training tool. It's not relief. It's not pain relief. And sometimes if we are using it as pain relief, we can be perpetuating issues. So if you are somebody who's hypermobile or tends to have lots of flexibility and you feel stuff that's tight all the time and you're constantly stretching it, you might actually be creating a larger gap now in your active and passive flexibility. Stretching is going to improve your passive flexibility, but if you have no active components to make sure that you own it, you're actually just creating a bigger deficit there, which, if we think about what I just said earlier on this podcast episode, then that's actually going to be increasing your opportunity for injury or just lack of potential for performance, which both things are not what we're looking for, right? That's the opposite of what everybody comes to this podcast to listen about. So we definitely don't want to be stretching just because something feels tight. We always want to do an assessment. Now, sometimes things are tight and they feel tight and they need stretch. Those things can happen. So sometimes I think we've gone way too far on the other side of the spectrum of never stretch. Like I said, it's a tool. But most people who are hypermobile, they don't need to stretch. They have lots of flexibility. And the tightness comes from their nervous system trying to reduce movement from happening. So it is our nervous system getting a muscle to contract as like a protective thing. And a lot of the time, if we just have more controlled movement and better strength in that area, those muscles will calm down. I am somebody who is a little bit more on the hypermobile side. I always have been. I was in gymnastics because of that, or I think I got into gymnastics or was better at gymnastics because of it, but I was a mediocre gymnast. I was not this amazing gymnast by any means, but I think my flexibility helped out with that a lot. And when I stopped doing gymnastics after my senior year of high school and went through undergrad and then gradually started sitting more and more, because I went from undergrad to grad school and I was studying a ton to get into physical therapy school. And then once I got into physical therapy school, it was literally 8 to 5 every single day sitting in class and then driving. I had to drive there and home, which was about a half an hour drive for me. And then I was sitting at home more often. I was barely walking, which are all the opposite of what I tell people to do to make sure we are mitigating pain and keeping healthy. But of course, that's what I was doing. And I had the most stiff, tight, achy neck all the time. Neck and upper back were just killing me. And it's no wonder that I was so tight. I had a lot of flexibility and I wasn't moving very often. And so cars were a lifesaver for me in PT school, but not until, of course, I didn't learn them until the very end of PT school. And it took me a lot of work to undo a lot of what happened in PT school from sitting so much. Where's the irony in that, actually, now that I'm thinking about it? But needless to say, a lot of times we need to just have more active, controlled movement and more awareness and give more active inputs into those tissues, because they're overprotective. They're getting in, and our nervous system is creating some tension in them to protect us from creating too much movement through those joints. This is also something, being hypermobile is also going to look like being told you're double jointed, which there's no such thing as double joints. You just have a joint, right? It's just very flexible, or being told that you are Gumby, or identifying as hyper flexible. Those are all going to be people who tend more towards the hypermobile spectrum. So those are all the people that I'm kind of talking about today. So if you are somebody who is kind of on this side of the spectrum, then this is going to be you. If you work with people who tend to be like this is going to be them as well. Those are some of the ways to kind of tell if you are somebody or work with somebody who is more hypermobile. So if that is you, or you know that you work with people like that, and I can almost guarantee you do, because if you are in the fitness industry, you are going to work with majority women, and majority of women tend to be more flexible. And if you are a clinician, you're going to find these people very often in your office, because once again, more women tend to seek help and more women are hypermobile. And also people who are hypermobile tend to have more pain. And I believe part of that is complicated, of course. Pain's layered. But if we are so flexible that we have all this range of motion, we typically have really low strength because we can get into lots of positions and rely on our passive structures, and that's a little bit more efficient for our brains than actually having to use active forces through our muscles. And when we are doing that, our strength kind of convinces our nervous system that we're safe. Like it produces like a safety sensation in a very reductionist way of looking at it. So when you lack strength, your brain is going to feel a little bit less safe, and you're going to have more tightness and more pain because pain is very directly related to how safe you feel. Now, again, that's a very oversimplified explanation of it, but sometimes it's easier to understand something like that. So it is not uncommon for people who are hypermobile to have a lot of pain for those reasons. So there are two things I want to talk about that are really important if you are exercising or wanting to work on improving your movement and you are or work with somebody who is hypermobile. Number one is going to be we really have to pay attention to control. And the second thing is going to be load management. So I'm going to talk about both, but today, first, we're going to talk about control. So when I say control, I mean that when I am doing a movement, the thing moving is what's moving. And I've mentioned this already in the podcast, but people who are hypermobile will be able to get into positions they don't own. And that means momentum or weights or gravity can pull us into these positions we don't own. But because we have the flexibility, we can get there easily. And that's never going to be ideal because, again, we'll rely on those passive structures. And that's not what we want. We want to train active tissues. Like the point of an exercise is to train active tissues. So when you are exercising, it's important to just pay attention to how you feel. Like, what am I feeling in this exercise, and is it what I'm supposed to be feeling? When I work with people, we will really drop the weight. I do not add a ton of weight right away, and I go and work really hard on coaching them to make sure that they are very intentional about their lifts. So some people can kind of go into a squat and come out of it and feel pretty good and feel like they are doing what they need, versus somebody who's hypermobile may need to pay a little bit more attention to, okay, I'm going to think about pulling myself down into the squat and then pushing the ground away from me as I stand back up. Those are going to be things that we have to pay more attention to, and this is actually one of the reasons that I love kin stretch, especially kinetic stretches. They really help us to learn how to control movements the entire way and pay attention to what we're feeling in our bodies. Again, kin stretch is phenomenal for that, and that is one of the reasons I love it. It was like all of the kin stretch is the application of the mobility principles that I utilize and do with people, and it helps hypermobile people or people who tend to be a little bit more flexible a ton since we focus on control. So when we are doing any sort of exercise, the number one thing that we want to pay attention to is that we are not pushing into closing angle sensations. And closing angle sensations just mean when you go to do a movement that there is an opening and closing angle. And if you don't quite understand angles, you might need to find somebody who does, who can educate you on what angles are. But on an opening side, we should feel a stretch. With hypermobile people, they're almost never going to feel a stretch. So when we are going into a closing angle, so the closing angle in a squat for your hips would be the front of your hips or your groin, you should never feel anything in that closing angle. We should not feel pinching. With hypermobile people, this is usually because we don't have control of the rotational small movements that happen to maintain space in our joint. And so we can sometimes get a little bit more jamming, which goes back to just working on small movements and making sure we own all of our ranges of motion. So when I tell people to build hip internal rotation strength, they're like, I don't do hip internal rotation. That doesn't look like anything that I do. But I promise you, it's not about mimicking things you do on a regular basis. It's about learning to control the tissues that do different things that you don't realize are happening. And you're working on a lot of internal rotation when you squat. And so this is, and internal rotation is very much what helps you maintain that space in your joint. So there's a little fun fact for you about squatting. So this is why we want to make sure that we are learning and understanding what we're feeling in the exercises, and we're making sure that we're doing slow and intentional lifts. So We want to make sure we can feel what we need to feel. We're avoiding closing angle symptoms. And then the other thing, like I said earlier, is I'm going to reduce the load and I'm going to work on slowing everything down. So I tend to do lots of tempo work. If you've been a client of mine, you're listening to this, you know that. I get cussed out a lot, not out of like pure hate, but out of my programming hate. I cuss myself out for my own programming, to be honest. I do this for myself too, because again, I'm hypermobile. So people who are hypermobile are going to really benefit from slower tempo. So that means like a 5-second eccentric, or a 3-second pause, or a 10-second pause, or a 30-second isometric. Those are things that I plan. And when we do the pauses and we do the slow movements, we are really focusing on what we're feeling, and this tends to be a way to slow things down. If we add speed to a movement, we are definitely going to reinforce the path of least resistance. And in movement, so when we go to move at all, our brain is always operating on what's the most efficient way for me to achieve this movement. It's always going to take the path of least resistance. So if you have one segment in your spine that moves a ton and other segments that don't, that one segment that moves a lot is definitely going to get overloaded. It's going to do most of the work because it's the most efficient way to move. So one of the ways that we work on this, for example, would be to make sure that you know how to move that spot. So I would literally regress the exercise until you can feel and move that spot and slowly progress it from there. And then when we go into lifting, we are going to be integrating that and slowing it down so we can make sure that we feel that. Same with any lift. If you are trying to make sure that you can feel what you need to feel and not push into positions that you don't own, not being shoved into ranges of motion that you don't have control over, then we are just going to add some tempo. And I promise tempo is like one of those secret sauces, but it's not so secret, but it's still not well known or well discussed enough that I will talk about it on my podcast like it's new. But most coaches out there and hopefully clinicians are going to recognize it and be like, yeah, I totally do that. And if that's you, then I'm high-fiving you from here because it's so beneficial. And it's just one of those simple ways to keep people moving, but also making sure that they're not just slamming into ranges of motion that they don't own. So this last final thing that I want to talk about when it comes to control is making sure that you know what exercises are going to be best for you. Again, not everybody with hypermobility is just super flexible in all the ranges of motion. Some people might have some limitations in their passive range of motion. But some people might just not have very strong movement in the ranges of motion that we need. One example of this, well, let me backtrack. So we want to make sure that you have the ranges of motion and the control of said ranges of motion. Control is synonymous for strength for the movement we're doing. So if I want to do an overhead press, for example, at a very bare minimum for the shoulder, my shoulder needs to be able to reach about 180 degrees of shoulder flexion. Meaning, if my thumb is facing the ceiling, as I bring my arm forward up towards my ear, I should be able to bring it all the way up to my ear without any pinching in my shoulder and without my back arching, without my rib cage lifting, and I should be able to get it all the way overhead. If I cannot do that without assistance or without moving my spine, then I do not have the prerequisites to do an overhead lift. That's like, there's no ifs, ands, and buts. That just is the way it is. The more weight you add to that movement, the less range of motion you're going to have. So if I can't do it with only my arm, only my body weight, then I'm not going to be able to do it when I add 95 pounds over my head. In fact, I'm going to compensate even more. Our bodies are, again, very efficient and they're very smart. So if you're asking your body to press 95 pounds overhead, it'll figure out a way to get it up there. Unless you're just like not strong enough at all, then it won't happen. But if you're strong, you will reinforce those compensation patterns or compensatory patterns, and we will get the barbell up overhead, and we will probably do so at the expense of something like our shoulder or our backs, because our brain doesn't care our brains don't care who they're stepping on to get the movement done, right? Our brain has one idea and one idea only, and it's get the mission accomplished, get the task accomplished, which is get the barbell overhead. So if you are somebody who is hypermobile or you work with people who are hypermobile, you want to make sure that you are giving them exercises and strength training exercises that are controlled, they're slow, intentional. You talk to them, make sure they feel what they need to feel, and then also making sure that they have the prerequisites for said exercises. The last thing I will say is it sounds like a lot like hypermobility is like, wow, it sucks. We have to work on all these things. But I just want to let you know that flexibility is really like having a lot of it Now, if you have an actual condition like EDS, that can be a little different. I will talk about that in a minute. But if you just are a little bit more on the hypermobile side, it's kind of a superpower because you're already halfway there. You have the range of motion. It's right there in front of you. You just have to make sure you do the work to capture it. Other people will have to stretch and stretch and stretch some more and be patient and be more patient and then work a little bit on capturing that movement, and they have to work really hard and just stretching. And honestly, I would rather not have to stretch a lot. I hate it. It's not fun, which is why I never achieved my middle splits in gymnastics because I sucked at them. And I just was like, well, I'll just do over splits with my forward splits and ignore my middle splits. So I never got them. Fun fact, I'm working on them right now. I've been working on them for most of 2022. And my goal is to get them by the end of the year. I think I'm really close. It'll happen well before that. Crazy what happens when you're a little bit consistent with flexibility work. But if you're hypermobile, hyperflexible, you have lots of ranges of motion, I just want to let you know that it's kind of a superpower. Like if you just add a little bit of control, a little bit of strength to that, it is very powerful. So keep in mind, again, as just like a little recap, when we are working with people, or if you are somebody who's hypermobile, we really want to make sure that we are controlling the movements that we do. And I do want to reiterate that sometimes we have to regress and regress and regress, like way more than we would want to be able to work on that. So a lot of kin stretch is literally just working on getting into positions and first learning how to contract a muscle in that position. Like, can you even access those tissues in that position? Because guess what? You can be able to bring your knee up off the ground into hip flexion. So we can do that from 0 to 90 degrees, but you cannot be strong in other ranges. So like if I bring your knee to your chest and ask you to hold it there, you might have no idea your leg exists and it might fall down to 90 degrees because your strength is going to be angle or position specific, meaning you can have strength and control in some positions, but not others. So when we work on this with people, when I work on this with people, we really have to make sure that we are regressing enough so that they can, one, find the tissues. If you're working on an exercise and either you or the person you're working with that's hypermobile doesn't have good access to those tissues, it's like, I don't even know what you're trying to do. It's just too hard. And this was something I fought for a long time. I was like, really, do I have to regress and regress? But yes, and I thought that if I regress, like there's no way that simple of an exercise is going to actually give me benefits, but I promise you it does. Like there's no way to know until you experience it. But I never thought so because how is that going to ever be helpful? I'm never going to be strong enough to actually move my own leg then with weight. But you really don't need to own all of it and be super strong in all of your ranges of motion, and just capturing a little bit more of it can have big return on investment for your time and energy. So when you are working on your exercises, step number one, again, is can you access the tissues? Can you contract tissues on both sides of the joint? Pails and rails are the best way to start doing that. They stand for progressive angular isometric loading and regressive angular isometric loading. Essentially, those two exercises are just isometrics. And isometrics just mean there's a contraction happening and nothing is moving. So it's super boring, I promise you. It's so boring, and it's an internal drive of you trying to contract that. That is that mind-muscle connection we talk about. And working on that is so unsexy and boring, but it is so amazing for your lifts in your general life that, again, you can't experience it or can't understand it until you experience it. But that's going to be where I start with people. And then eventually we try to work on some lift offs and just can you move? That's what a lift off or a passive range hold is. Can you get a little bit more of your passive range of motion to be active range of motion? Meaning, can you get to that end range where you almost can't control it and lift your leg or lift your arm? That's all we're looking for. It's just small little movements. If you want some examples, I talk and show a lot of examples on my Instagram, on my reels. So definitely check those out. And we have some examples, I believe, on our YouTube channel as well. But that's where I always start with people is, one, awareness with cars. So I didn't mention that, but we always are going to do with cars because there is nothing more fundamental than understanding when I'm moving my shoulder, what is shoulder movement versus what is spine. And that's at a very baseline level what cars is helping you do. And then number 2 is going to be pails and rails. Can I access those tissues? And then we're going to build that strength up, working on contracting them more and more. And then step number 3 is going to be, can I do liftoffs? Can I move my own limb against gravity? And can I start to capture a little bit more of that passive range of motion and turn it into active control? And then from there, you can get more complicated. But that's how I work with people. So that's how we work on control. Now, the second most important thing to pay attention to if you're hypermobile or work with people who are hypermobile is load management. And if control and load management sounds like what I say for almost everybody with any sort of rehab goal or movement goal, that's because it is. And it's really just how we tailor it to the population and to their goals and needs. But these are like the baseline foundation of this is like what rehab is, right? It's learn how to control and make sure we restore what you need, and then work on building that up and then making sure we're managing your loads. So load management really boils down to balancing your stress and your recovery. So if we think about the scale, we have one side, we have stress, and stress isn't just like, oh my gosh, I'm so stressed, I have this new presentation that I have to create. Stress is also the loads that are on our body. So your exercise and your different types of workouts are a stressor to your body. And then your other side of the scale is going to be your recovery. That is, yes, obviously it's going to be the times when you're down regulating, right? Getting into that parasympathetic state. But it's also just going to be times where you're not doing the thing that is stressing you out. So it's both balancing your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And it's also just making sure we have adequate pushes and adequate pullbacks, right? So it's really important to understand that, because a lot of people will be like, well, I didn't work out for 2 days. Well, cool. But what did those days look like? And they'll be like, well, I walked 12,000 steps. I ran around with my dog. I ran around with my kid, and they're doing all these things and like they're super active. So sometimes it's really important that like you need to understand, if we think of like I'm very visual. So I'm thinking in my head of like graph. If we think about stress and like doing exercises and loads being super high on the graph, those are our push days. And then we think about rest days. We should be like all the way down, like a quote unquote recovery 5K, especially if it's in like zone 4 for running, is not recovery. Recovery is like walking in maybe light level cars, and that's it. It's literally like doing nothing. So we want to make sure that we're not staying in this like medium level of I'm resting, but like I'm not fully resting because hustle culture makes me feel like I can't rest. Like, nope, we got to pull you all the way back. So this balance is really, really important for people with hypermobile like joints, or who tend to be more hypermobile, but especially with EDS, because people with EDS have actual connective tissue issues. So they have problems with the what's the word I'm looking for? Metabolism. There it is. Wow. I'm going to blame that one on daylight savings time. But they have difficulty with repairing their collagen, metabolizing their collagen and other proteins. And so they're going to be at a higher risk for injuries. So it's really going to be important to make sure that we are not overtraining. And when you have too much stress and not enough recovery, that is when you're at a high risk for overtraining. So the other reason this is important, and I kind of touched on this earlier, is that hypermobility usually means we have less support, less strength and ability to just like hold our bodies upright against gravity. So strength is typically super low. We tend to rely more on passive tissues. We don't necessarily feel as grounded or safe in our bodies, and that facilitates a lot more tightness and pain. And then on top of that, I will touch on this, but if you've been given a specific diagnosis of EDS or any sort of hypermobility disorder, and on a side note, pretty much any other disorder that makes you feel fearful of your body, it makes you feel fragile, it makes you feel afraid to load your body, which is a lot of diagnoses. And I talked about this in arthritis, and I've talked about this at length and about everything in the arthritis podcast episode, that is. We are going to feel a lot more fragile. And the more afraid we are of moving our bodies, the more pain we're going to experience, because we are afraid. And fear is very highly directly related to pain, more so than actual tissue damage to an extent. So your fear of moving is going to create more problems for you, or just as many problems as if you actually had some sort of tissue damage. So I will say this because the people that I have worked with who have EDS have a ton of fear, and I believe have been fear-mongered, and this is not their fault. This is very much how healthcare providers have educated them and worked with them. And there are some very serious repercussions depending on the severity of EDS that you're dealing with, but the amount of fear that's involved is going to be very, very problematic for them just feeling okay and safe with movement. And every little thing, every little flare up, they're going to be like red flag in their head. And that's going to make it more of a problem than it actually is. So all of those things accumulate as stress. So if you have a lot of fear, that is stress. That is bringing your sympathetic nervous system up to basically promote less like recovery. And I talked about this in the pain science episodes, but when we are in sympathetic nervous system, we're in fight or flight mode. We are like preparing to run or fight something. We are not in, like, there's nothing else we can do at that point. Our bodies are prepared. When we are in parasympathetic mode, we are resting and digesting. And the third thing that I like to explain in that is recovering. So when we are resting and digesting, we are also recovering and we are repairing. So rest, digest, repair, recover. That's what we're doing when we are in parasympathetic mode. So if we are not actively working on that a lot, we are not going to recover as quickly, and that's going to be problematic. So if you are somebody with EDS or any person with any hypermobility, it's going to be really important that we, one, make sure that we are not progressing too fast. We want to make sure we start slow and low. Again, body weight is not going to be a problem, especially if you're working on control. You can make body weight pretty hard. Ask almost anybody who's taken any of my Kin Stretch with Dr. Jen classes. They are not easy, and we pretty much only use body weight in most of them until the end of this year when we add some props. So we start slow. We start without a ton of load. That doesn't mean we can't progress, but I like to be more conservative when I start because it's easier to push. It is really hard if you try and you start too heavy and then have to pull back. It's just more annoying and frustrating. So I tend to be more conservative. So we want to start with like lower loads and lower weight. So when we are managing our loads for lifting and exercising, it's not just how heavy something is, it's also the volume, like how much of what we're doing. And that can be measured in your weights and sets and reps. That can also be measured in the intensity of the cardio you're doing and then the length of time. But that's the stuff that we're going to pay attention to, and we're going to see like how those stresses or how those movements are stressing our bodies and where those loads are being placed on our tissues to make sure that we are not placing too much too soon before they're prepared. Again, another thing to think about when we are working, especially if we're working on strength training, because strength training is going to just be a progressive form of control, right? We're starting with maybe body weight or control, but we're always going to be working on adding some sort of load. Body weight is still load, by the way. Even isometrics are still load. They're just forces, which just so you know. But as we go through and we're working on strength training, we really do want to make sure we are progressively overloading. But somebody with EDS or somebody with hypermobility may take a little bit longer to recover. So we aren't going to progress as fast. And if you're somebody who is a little bit more hypermobile and you're used to like a linear progression in strength training, that just means like adding 5 or 10 pounds like every week regularly. That works until it doesn't. And for a majority of people, it's going to be too fast. So we just have to understand that you might be doing the same exact workout with same sets and reps and the exact same weight for a while. And I would argue that some of the people I work with will stick with that type of weight until it feels easier. Like I don't push it, again, because I tend to be more conservative. So, and the way that I kind of test to see, are we pushing enough? Do we need to pull back, is going to be, one, I always am asking about pain levels. 2, your cars are a great litmus test. So if you feel like really stiff and achy, or your cars are suddenly like your range of motion is limited, then we probably need to pull back a little bit. Also, your fatigue, like, are you feeling under recovered? Like, do you feel like you got hit by a cement truck? Then we are not recovering very well. We need to look at that. And last but not least, I love using RPE, or rate of perceived exertion. So this is a great way to tell if people are recovering, because one day we'll be doing the same exact weight and they can be really recovered and it can feel like pretty good, maybe a 7 or 8 RPE, just like on a scale of 0 to 10. 10 is going to be like, I've given my max effort. There's absolutely nothing else that I could do. 0 is going to be literally like paralyzed, like laying, you can't move, you can't exert any sort of physical effort, or one is going to be just like sitting there, just resting. So you want to think about a 7 or 8 is going to be like, I only have like another couple reps in the tank and I'm going to have to really squeeze them out. So if you're thinking about that and you're recovered and maybe like you were doing a 40-pound squat at a 7 RPE, and then the next week you're like warming up with a 20-pound dumbbell and you're like, wow, this already feels like a 6 RPE, then that is a great indicator that you might just not be as recovered. And so a great way to make sure that you are not pushing too much is to use RPE and then to adjust your programming accordingly. If you are new to this, you're not necessarily going to be super perfect at it. It's something that gets better with experience, but in my opinion, that's one of the best ways that I have to like measure how people are feeling and kind of pull back or push based off of what their RPE is when they start to do their warm-up sets. But again, I always start conservatively and then we just slowly push, but you're going to have a slower progression than somebody who may not have a lot of hypermobility. So your training age is going to be very important to consider here. The longer you lift, the faster typically you might be able to push because you've built that baseline tissue capacity. And when we think about people with hypermobility, we are not just training muscles when I work with them. I am also thinking about their tendons and their ligaments and their passive structures, and we are trying to strengthen those. And those are going to take months to years plus to really strengthen and build up. So this is something to keep in consideration too. We are just going to work over many months and years to build back those or build up those tissue capacities. And so if they've been working on strength training for a while, then I don't have to be as conservative because they've already built that baseline. But if not, then we are going to be a little bit more conservative and not push as fast and as hard. And we're going to let the body catch up as it needs. So the other thing so that's kind of how I pay attention to load management. And the other thing is that's managing the stress side of the scale. Managing the recovery side is going to be making sure we are actually recovering when we are recovering. And I've already hinted at this, but most people will still be in this sympathetic, like I'm stressed out type of mode when they're on their rest days. And that's not allowing your body to fully rest and recover. So the things that I do and work on with my clients and patients is really make sure that we are putting extra work towards recovery and parasympathetic mode. This might be some mindset work, so I might have to talk to them a little bit about some of the way they feel about their body and their fear. Sometimes that is something we really have to work through, and that can be like multiple sessions, large amounts of the sessions as we're exercising. We're talking about like, hey, look at this, like you're able to do this, and okay, you were able to do this before, you're not able to today. What happened in between? Maybe it's not that something's injured and all of a sudden problematic in your body. It just might be your nervous system and how you're feeling and your brain's perception of everything. And that is something I have to work on like regularly, almost every session with people. The other things when it comes to recovery is making sure we are putting added work to parasympathetic work. Relaxation and like learning how to relax and how to bring our bodies into that parasympathetic state is effort, and it's a skill. Let me say that again. Relaxation and learning how to bring yourself into a parasympathetic state and regulate your nervous system takes effort and is a skill. Relaxing in front of the TV and zoning out is not necessarily going to give you the same results as working on any sort of meditation or breath work. So the way that I typically work on this with people is going to start with just breath work. I do breath work with everybody anyways because diaphragm control is one of the most important ways, and not most important, but one of the simplest ways to really have a huge effect on your nervous system and bring it over to a parasympathetic mode. But also, it is the baseline for creating core stability. So if I'm going to work on core stability with everybody, then I might as well teach them how to utilize breath work for bringing yourself to a parasympathetic state. So this is going to be huge. I work on this with people. We change our breathing pattern depending on whether we are sympathetic or parasympathetic, which state we're in. And so if we are not paying attention, a lot of us kind of live in that breathing pattern that is very sympathetic. And so just mindfully working on that as often as we can throughout the day, and then dedicating some time in the evening to really work on learning how to control our diaphragm in all the directions. Those are the ways that I work on recovery. And then the last thing is just really making sure that we have rest days as needed in between our sessions. And for some of my clients, it's hard, but we will have like more rest days, and we will slowly work at like 1 or 2 sessions per week, and they will work on getting up to like maybe 2 or 3. But we just have to slowly introduce them and introduce their bodies to those loads and allow them enough adequate recovery time. So those are all of the things. It's a little longer episode today, but those are all the things that I pay attention to when I'm working with a hypermobile population. So we always want to pay attention to control. We always want to make sure that we are not using momentum and getting super sloppy unless we have built that really good strength and we own all of those ranges of motion. We want to make sure we know what we feel in those movements. We avoid any closing angle pain. We want to make sure that we can control and feel what we need to feel. And then we want to make sure we're balancing our stress and exercise loads with our recovery. And that means making sure that the load is not too much too soon, making sure they have adequate recovery time. Because again, strength training, it damages our tissues. Like it is little micro tears in our tissues. So if you were ever afraid of injuries, by the way, and pain, just know that delayed onset muscle soreness is like a mild version of pain. It's not mild by any means, but like it's a controlled version of pain, and it's still pain. Like it's still pain. It's just we know that and know it and expect it because we did something that we logically can think in our heads, oh, I did this to create this. A lot of other pain, sometimes we have a hard time understanding. I didn't do anything to intentionally create it, but it's the unintentional things that we do sometimes that facilitate that. So anyways, DOMs are going to create little micro tears, and so we really have to make sure that we are recovering and allowing those tissues to recover and rebuild before we go back to it and progress all of that. So people who have more hypermobility may need a little bit more rest time, and they're definitely going to need to pay more attention to making sure we really work on that parasympathetic activation and like nervous system regulation, especially if they tend to feel really fearful and uncomfortable in their bodies. So we really have to work on learning to regulate our nervous systems to allow our bodies to actually recover in between our workouts or training sessions so that we can make progress that we want to make. So hopefully all of that was helpful. If, of course, you learned anything or you liked what you heard, please let me know. If you have questions, also feel free to reach out. I am happy to chat with you about anything that you've heard on the podcast. So with that being said, we have some really great things planned for the next few episodes. So stay tuned for those. I'm really excited. We are starting to bring guests on the podcast. So with that being said, if there is anybody that you would love to hear from specifically that you think would be a great fit for the Movement Upgraded podcast, or there's a topic that might be a little bit not my expertise, but you may think that it would be beneficial for the podcast or you want to hear more about, please just reach out to me. You can message me on Instagram at Jen Hosler or email me at jen@movementupgraded.com and let me know. I'm happy to check that out and look into it. But I already have, I think, 3 guests planned for the next several podcast episodes. So stay tuned for those. We're going to learn some awesome things. So with that being said, I will chat with you in the next episode.